I watched this brilliant documentary by Adam Curtis. It's a 4-part documentary. It's on YouTube, and it's called The Century of Self. It was so good. Like, it basically told the story of the 20th century through a psychological perspective.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
So it all starts with Sigmund Freud, basically. I don't know if you know Sigmund Freud.
Yeah.
Every guy secretly wants, it's kind of disgusting, but every guy secretly wants to have sex with their mom and kill their dad and all kinds of Freud isn't just that, but like he's most influenced by that theory. But he's the godfather of psychoanalysis. And what happens is he gives us these ideas basically of human beings, how within every human being, because before I even get into this, during the 1800s, from what I know, the conventional view was that if you just act properly at all times, you could be a very sophisticated, rational human being. I think that was a massive thing in Britain. It was a massive thing in Austria, where Sigmund Freud grew up. What makes Freud so famous and why he's still talked about today is the fact that, well, no matter how often you try and act rational and proper, deep down within every human being, there's a conscious and rational self, but there's also a deeply hidden, irrational, highly sexual, unconscious self. And this is where the emotions come in: aggression, sexual desire, and all kinds of things. And he says, that's a massive part of human beings. And this overshadows the entire 20th century, because then you have people like Hitler coming about like, well, if we're all irrational, then let's go and have some war with one another and stuff like that. And you get them these world wars and like nuclear weapons and stuff. Anyway, it's not the only cause of that, but Freud's thinking that, because Freud was a reaction to the Enlightenment. Enlightenment was 1600s, 1700s, and it influenced the 1800s as well, saying, well, we have reason, and we can, if we really try, we can just be really reasonable human beings who will get along. And this peaked with Kant, who was like one of the leading figures of Enlightenment, who came up with his theory of global peace, that because human beings can be super rational, that we could all, well, if we're all super rational, there's no reason to go to war with one another and create pain for one another. We could all just live in peace and get along and trade and eat cake and stuff. So that's the predominant thinking in 1600s, 1700s. 1800s, you have the Victorians who actually believe this stuff, despite the fact that they're going to other places like Africa, India, whatever, and just like butchering people. But that's all underneath the rug. You don't tell people about that. But the Europeans, I think a lot of them genuinely believe that they were trying to civilize less developed people. And what happens in the start of the 1900s is Freud comes about and says, well, no, you're just bullshitting yourselves. You're not trying to do that. You're just as bad as those people you're trying to civilize. We human beings, regardless of race, regardless of culture, regardless of everything, we all possess rational side and an irrational side. And no matter how hard you try, that irrational side will always be with you. And this leads to his nephew. Okay, so his nephew is this really interesting guy called Edward Bernays. And he becomes one of the 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century, according to Time. He takes Freud's ideas and he creates something called public relations, a massive field today. You can go and get a job in public relations. He creates it. He says, well, he takes the ideas of Walter Lippmann. And Walter Lippmann, I did a video on him, basically said how democracy doesn't really work, because how could anyone make a well-informed decision about their country when the average person doesn't spend even 15 minutes of the day staying up with current affairs? Like how could you have a democratic society that works when the average person has no idea about what the best thing to do with the country is? And Edward Bernays took his ideas and said, well, if the human being is so susceptible to certain just fragments of information, well, we can use images and we can influence them and we can almost brainwash them to do whatever we want them to do. And this guy was picked up by the leading politicians in the US to form public opinion, to control the masses. And these ideas were then again used by the Nazis, by Joseph Goebbels, who served Hitler, and so on. And this was the story of the early 20th century, leading political figures using propaganda and public relations.
Yeah.
Edward Bernays knew it was propaganda, but he knew that people would hear propaganda and think, oh, that's bad. So he just created the term public relations to sound friendly.
Yeah.
And what happens is they use this to try and manipulate the masses. Now, come to the 40s, late 40s, 50s, after World War II, Freud's now dead, but his daughter has grown up. And his daughter takes his ideas to the extreme, thinking, yes, there is this irrational side of human beings, but through psychotherapy, we could retrain human beings so that they do just become rational human beings. And we can live in this perfect America. Thus came the American dream, so big in the 50s, of the happy husband with the happy wife and the happy children and the white picket fence and the nice house. And if you could just get that, then you could be happy. And that's the American dream. And that's why in the 50s, this idea of the American dream becomes so big, because of the ideas of Freud's daughter, who was, and psychotherapy becomes huge in 50s, 60s America. That if people could just go sit down and discuss their problems for long enough, they could cure themselves of problems. They wouldn't have problems anymore. And we could all be living the American dream, this rational world. Come the late 60s, 70s, there's again a backlash to this, saying it doesn't matter how long people talk about their problems, they're still going to come across problems. That doesn't fix everything. And you have hippie culture come about, and it's all about, well, if I'm this irrational and rational being and stuff, I'm clearly like a special part. Like, look, I don't know how this fit in, but in the late 60s and onwards, people started becoming, from what the documentary said, much more individualistic. It was no more about conforming to a community, that 50s ideal that everyone could conform to a certain way and be happy. In the 60s and onwards, people suddenly start becoming much more individualistic. And this really takes off in the 1980s, when marketeers and propaganda and public opinion people recognize that people respond. You know, the 60s, the hippies said, well, we don't want to conform to capitalist society. We're against that. But they still wanted to make themselves feel heard and make themselves feel special. And the capitalists then go, well, seeing that we now know this about them, why don't we sell them products that make them feel special and unique and individual? And that's exactly what happened. And in the 80s, you have people, this era of glam and color, and you have Thatcher and Reagan both understood this. This is why they won. They started changing their language, whereas the language of the politicians in the early 20th century was always, if we come together as a community, we can overcome anything. The language of the 80s used by Thatcher and Reagan was, we want to give individuals freedom to do what they want. That's the type of politician we are. We don't want to try and control you. We want to give you the freedom to do whatever you want. And people in this new individualistic age go, oh, they understand me. I want to be a free, special individual. I'll vote for them. And that's exactly what happened. Now, come the 90s, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, realizing what Thatcher and Reagan did, tried to do something similar. They hand out these surveys, get everyone to answer questions about themselves, and then they just tell people what they want to hear. Okay, Tony Blair noticed that individualism was still a massive thing. So he's like, yeah, I want to give people the chance to really be themselves and express themselves and so on. But what happened then was they were literally just telling the public what they wanted to hear rather than resolving issues. And then it brought us into the modern age where the film ended. I'd love that if he could do a part 2, that'd be brilliant. But it was, you got to watch it. It was a phenomenal documentary.